Crimea, we had a month-long campaign. We are going to talk about the religious communities in Crimea, human rights violation, and the persecution on political grounds. To have our guests include Ismagilov, Mufti of the Clerical Board of Ukrainian Muslims, Ievstratiy, Archbishop of Chernihiv, Nizhyn, Oleksandr Sagan, Ukrainian theologist, senior researcher of the Hryhorii Skovoroda Philosophy Institute of the National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine, and Andriy Yurash, Director of Religion and Nationalities Department at the Ministry of Culture of Ukraine, is going to be here. Anatoliy Kalyuzhnyi, pastor of Nove zhuttya, New Life Protestant Church. This is actually, we are talking about the presence of the different churches on the Crimean Peninsula. We are my colleagues told me that this information is going to be updated, so you can visit this website and see the availability of different churches. Now we give the floor to our guests just for them to say what's going on now in the Crimea, what is the situation, and all the rest. You have the floor, Your Reverences. Thank you. First of all, I would like to note here that the situation in the Crimea for the religious community is absolutely complex from the different points of view, and hard, I mean. First of all, we're talking about the attitude towards the fact what happened to the Crimea, actually. And here, for both for the believers and for the clergy, for the religious communities, this issue is not just a theoretical one. This is the issue pertaining to their life per se, how they should, what should be their attitude to what happened to the Crimea last year, in the spring of last year. And accordingly, quite a number of different problems come to the surface, especially for those who does not actually agree to what has happened to Crimea, who do not consider that Crimea is part of the Russian territory, and who believes that the events of last year are actually an occupation. Those who are persuaded ensure that Crimea is part of Ukraine, especially those who remain to be the citizens of Ukraine, but they stay and reside in Crimea, continue to be believers of the clergy. Accordingly, we have a number of different problems. Since the Russian authorities and the Crimean authorities believe that the Crimea is a territory of Russia, and accordingly, Russia has its sovereignty over this area, and they have to act. They may act accordingly. Specifically, we're talking about the religious community. And the first problem which lies on the surface is the problem associated with registration of religious communities. According to the laws adopted by the Russian Federation after the occupation of the Crimea, they established the demand or the requirement for registration of all the religious communities under the Russian Federation legislation. They actually established some terms of period of time. First, they established the January 1 this year, then March 1 this year. Now, in a very fast manner, they adopted the decision that this term can be extended until January the 1st next year. So maybe a dozen or several dozens of religious communities now in the Crimea actually underwent registration under the Russian Federation legislation. And I'm talking about till the January 1st this year. And until March 1, number of those registered religious communities did not increase drastically. Well, what's the reason? First of all, this is a very complicated process. And number two, this process is a multi-stage one. So first, the registration should be done or should, first of all, the managerial management agents, bodies of the religious communities have to be registered, and then whatever is subordinated to them. If you're talking about certain associations or communities, that's why the legislation which has been introduced in the Crimea is so complex and complicated. So for the religious communities still are kind of in the suspended state. Another problem which is close to our confession, this is something associated with the following issue. To be registered under Russian legislation can be done only by the Russian Federation citizens. If you're talking about religious community, the chance to come through the registration for non-Russian citizens is so much hard, difficult, and complicated, it's next to impossible to do that. And accordingly, those clergy and the believers who did not agree to become citizens of Russia or were not issued the Russian Federation passports, they not only lose their right to register as their community under the Russian Federation legislation, and hence they lose their right even to do that. The Ukrainian law allows the religious community to administer their beliefs or, let's say, their confession, not only without registration, but even without some specific, let's say, notification of the authorities about their, let's say, activities. Only in some specific cases they have to ask for registration. In the Russian Federation, the religious activity is possible to be carried out only by the registered religious communities. That's why our religious community of the Kiev Patriarchate parish have the principal position. We as the church do not, let's say, perceive or do not agree to the fact of the occupation of Crimea. That's why we continue to act under the Ukrainian legislation and laws and legislation in accordance with the Russian Federation legislation. We do not believe it to be something which is absolutely necessary to do. So far, we managed to safeguard and to keep and hold that stance or position. And we are going to do that as long as possible, but nobody knows what would happen in the future. Hence, some practical problems without Russian registration or Russian Federation registration. This leads to the impossibility to open the bank accounts or to pay the communal services payments or to pay for some other, to effect some other, let's say, compulsory and payments. And we find ourselves, our religious communities, in a very difficult situation. And also we face the problem of the right to the ownership, to the real estate, first of all, to the offices, to the plots of land, etc. Our parish was addressed or approached by certain Russian occupation authorities, and they proposed that our communities be registered. They actually showed their interest in having our communities be registered, but when we put the questions how those communities be registered, like a Kiev Patriarchate communities, they say no, this is a very complicated process. There is such a structure is not existent in the Crimea, and we have to create something like that or establish. So it better register yourselves as some independent Orthodox community, etc. If we are talking about the Orthodox religious community, which is not connected to the Kiev Patriarchate, this is not a direct, but somehow anyway they trying to push us, to push our confession to break with the Kiev Patriarchate of the whole Ukraine, by the way, which is done in all other confessions and the religious communities. So they are try to carry out the specific activities in order to introduce in the Crimean territory the Russian religious structures and to subordinate the Crimean religious structures to the Russian Federation structures. And they do that along the lines of the Catholic Church, but this is very difficult to do that in practice. But what they do, they take the priest, the chief priest in the Simferopol temple, they actually ousted him from the Crimea under the pretext that he doesn't have a special documents which permit them to stay on the Crimean territory, and he was replaced by the Russian priest who came from Russia specifically for this purpose. So formally, they didn't change the shell of that, the external shell, but they just replaced the clergy. The same happens in the Protestant, among the Protestants or in the Muslim religious confessions. There were some attempts on the part of the Russian Federation centers to introduce either new centers or to subordinate those to them. The same holds for the Judas, the Hebrews religious confession. Most of them were forced to leave the Crimean territory, which was announced even 1 year back by the chief rabbi of Ukraine, who said that, if we are talking specifically about Sebastopol, when there was the Ukrainian authority, under control of the Ukrainian authority, there was no kind of persecution or some difficulties, but as soon as the Russians came there, so the synagogue building was covered with anti-Semitic inscriptions and graffiti and whatnot. So they were forced to leave the Crimea, the chief rabbi, and take all the parishioners with him.
Another problem we are facing now, this is psychological pressure. First of all, through the special services, federal security service, they call us to have certain interviews. They come to us and they are trying to push us to be loyal to Russia. And again, not only people that are responsible for religious activity in those services are working with us, but as well the department that is responsible for fighting extremism, so-called Department A, that is involved in anti-terroristic activity, and they are bullying priests. Last year it was indirect pressure on the believers. They visited our services and they said, they noted, they made certain notes in our sermon, and of course you understand what are the feelings of priests and true believers when they understand that somebody who is of course not that friendly is sitting here, represented Russian repressive agencies. It reminds me the case of closure of Jewish theater after Semen Michaels was murdered. So what did they do? They just sent a photographer there, and this photographer made shots of each and every person entering the funeral. So in 1 month they closed this theater and they told everybody nobody wants to go to this theater. They use the same methods now. We have around 10 religious communities in Crimea of Kiev Patriarchate, and a few of them were had to stop their activity. Why? Because 3 temples were captured by so-called self-defense forces of Crimea. The most picturesque case happened in Perevalnoye, near Simferopol, and in a year a chain of communities, up to 5 of them, they lost the opportunity to use the premises of where the services we exercised. So in many cases they were told directly that if you will use these premises, you will have problems, you will be checked, and please clear these premises in order not to have excessive problems. In Kerch, in Sudak, those were such cases, and finally I would like to stress that our church, our confession belongs to Kiev Patriarchy, and in Crimea it was a national structure that was involved tightly into Ukrainian national way of life. And Ukrainian Kiev Patriarchy communities, they were and they still are the core of Ukrainian national way of life. So in this sense, they are the only structures of this cultural type in Crimea. And we are very active in international sense, and here in Ukraine we point out once and once again that Russia has a chain of obligations according to international treaties and agreements, specifically in the field of the rights of religious communities. Now we were put in a position of religious minority in Crimea, so Russia should observe its obligations, and international organizations must monitor or run a monitoring of such behavior of Russian authorities. And we must defend our believers and defend the right of any person to confession, to national identity in occupied Crimea, and we hope that sooner or later this occupation ends up and Crimea will be free in this sense. Thank you very much. As Archbishop, I would like to give floor to Sayyid Ismagilov, Mufti of Crimean Muslim community, Mufti. First of all, I would like to say that in the last half of year, the pressure on the Crimean Muslims is continuing, and around 20,000 Crimean Tatars Muslims had to fled from Crimea. They moved to other regions of Ukraine, and there are different types of different people, say functionaries of Crimean Majlis. There were a chain of detentions, investigations, etc. So not only believers leave Crimea for other parts according to their confessional beliefs, because in Crimea there is nothing like a freedom of religious activities. And in fact, in Crimea, the Muslim religious communities could not live normal life. As well, Crimean Tatars and Muslims leave Crimea because of their national ideas, national beliefs. We have a lot of Muslims that fight in the armed forces of Ukraine. Unfortunately, in Crimea, their families they are under search, investigations, and many people I met that had to evacuate their families from Crimea because of this danger. So this streamline of refugees is still is still in place, and Crimean Tatars, they continue to travel from Crimea to other places in Ukraine, in spite of all the actions of Russian authorities to keep Tatars in Crimea. So we had certain changes. You probably remember very well that the activity of Crimean Tatar TV channel ATR stopped its activity, and children channel as well, Tatar children channel was stopped its activity because they didn't get the re-registration. And this Crimean channel was liberal to a certain extent, and it was probably the only one source of the freedom of speech in Crimea. And the broadcasting of this channel was stopped because of they were rejected of licenses and permits to broadcast. So Crimean people, they do not have now any media of their national nature. That was as well not very comfortable. That was a great blow for the national religious minority, but people, they still hope on sooner or later this dictatorship be stopped. As well, the Crimean Muslims were hinted that at their mourning date, it's 18th May, when it was a deportation of Crimean Tatars, and representatives of all the Crimean communities, Crimean Tatar communities, they gathered in the central Simferopol Square to commemorate all their family members that were punished, that died as a result of Stalin deportation. There was a hint already that you do not need to do that. You may not do this public. You better do it privately at your households and mosques. And last year they even had the military helicopters over the people gathered to commemorate this deportation date, because 1/3 of our people, they died at that process of deportation. So they even tried to scare people by means of helicopters, military helicopters. This is a very uncomfortable feeling when you have a military helicopter over your head. As well, there was an announcement from pro-Russian authorities on the reconstruction of the ancient part of Simferopol, where we have a lot of religious and national monuments and some other buildings. Not only the central mosque of Simferopol, they have Sophia Sheikh tombs at the same place. Some dervishes, they as well were buried there. Unfortunately, in independence time, when Ukraine controlled Crimea, religious organizations failed to hold control over these religious places, and now our people are thinking about what it will be with that religious monuments, religious spots, because the reconstruction of the central part of Simferopol have been already announced and it soon be started. So certain pressure is applied on religious activists, public activists of Crimean Tatars in Crimea. Now we are facing a new tactics when units, military units, police units are surrounding settlements, and they go with a thorough total search. This is some kind of a new technique, and many people, they understand this as a scaring exercise. As well, the searches in religious and educational agencies are still going on. First of all, many Muslims that belong to Habashi movement, they blame religious activities, Muftis, religious and national activists and educational facilities, that they are not loyal to Russia, that they are pro-Ukrainian. They blame us that we are extremists, and no grounds for such convictions. So last week we had a search in Medrese, which is educational facility in Kulchugino. They use certain religious activists that are loyal to Russia, and they ask them to put the charges or blame to our priests, our people. Not all of the communities happened to be registered again. Many of them stopped their activity because they failed to register. Certain communities, they do not want to be re-registered according to Russian legislation. Certain communities that are now at the edge of this registration, they feel that they've been bullied to be re-registered. As part of officially registered religious center, they refused to be registered as independent community, and in many cases certain communities that are not registered according to Ukrainian legislation, but that are not registered according to Russian legislation, but they are registered according to Ukrainian legislation as a part of some center that works in Ukraine. It is very difficult for them to work and to run their activity. So many Muslims, they are feeling themselves suspended in a way in Crimea, and in many cases they hope for liberalization, for greater level of tolerance to Muslims. But everybody knows that this special pressure is applied to pro-Ukrainian communities because they refused to cheat its own motherland. Because any true believer, if he is true believer, then he is true and to all the values, means to its motherland, to its citizenship, etc. Because it's kind of an oath they had in their past. In many cases, the communities, they could not position themselves somehow in Crimea, so hopefully this negative experience we had will be terminated, and Crimea will be again a part of Ukraine, and further on the religious and cultural life will develop according to democratic and tolerant laws of Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to turn the microphone to Anatoliy Kalyuzhnyi, the priest of the Protestant Church, New Life, just to ask you what happened in Slavyansk, what the Russian world, Russian world members did then, or the militants Russian did there. Good afternoon. First of all, I would like to remind you, generally speaking, what we started with in 2014 in the Crimea. we had more than 2,000 religious communities, all in all, on the territory of the Crimea. And this 5.6% of all the number of all the total number of the religious communities of Ukraine. I would like to say that the Protestants in the Crimea are taking into consideration the religious freedom given by Ukraine to them. We had more than 20% of the Protestant churches out of the total number of the churches in the Crimea. By the way, in the Sevastopol, we had even this number was 27% even. What the situation available today there? 1 year it was kind of brutal pressure on each community, and now the local authorities work selectively, and there is a pressure exerted.
Категорія
Subdivided the Protestant communities in two categories. By the way, none of the religious communities received any kind of official registration in the Crimea. Number two, they subdivided all the communities in different categories. The first category, the most powerful and mighty, and the weaker ones. By the way, about 30% of all the Protestant communities do not have their own buildings, and they have to pay the rental or lease out, rent the official buildings from the local authorities. And if you're talking about this towards registration, there is a great pressure exerted on the people, so that the majority of the Protestant communities who had the right to rent or to lease some of the official buildings, and not because without that they cannot even work or act under this or within this legislation field or legal field. And by the way, all those people we managed to contact, and from Protestant churches, they say that there is individual treatment, so to say, of the leaders of the churches by these special secret agents and secret services. Very powerful treatment, I would say, or the processing, I would say, of the leaders of the Protestant churches. Moreover, all their contacts with the Ukraine, territorial Ukraine, or to leave their whereabouts and go there is, or even their correspondence is being verified, etc. And if there is at least a hint that they have a kind of cooperation with Ukraine. Why they do that? Because Protestants have always been for Russia some aliens, and they actually call the Protestant churches the pro-American churches. And unfortunately, we can sense, we feel it where there is a serious problem there. We have a lot of major associations, and we can see that we can lose a lot if the person has a Ukrainian status or a citizen of Ukraine. In fact, this person can be a pastor or the priest in our church, or generally speaking, cannot do anything, let's say, to lead an active life in the Crimea or do anything there. And we are talking about those people who actually had to leave the church because they refused to take the Russian citizenship. And there is a big danger that this specific year, if this situation persists and no Protestant communities are going to be registered, then they will become outlaws, and they won't be able to make use of the offices or the buildings they have now, or to, let's say, to carry out their functions. And by the way, this is a very delicate way or path to oust Protestantism from the Crimea, generally speaking. We also had several delegations from Moscow to Kiev, from Protestant churches, in order to be involved in some kind of negotiations, or the Baptists or the if it is the believers had to try to persuade them to give their facilities and structures to the local pro-Russian authorities. And really, you have to admit that the Baptists community, Russian community in Moscow is a pro-Kremlin and pro-Putin. They support the Putin aggression against Ukraine, and our leaders cannot give their blessing to the people to take this step. That's why the Baptist churches, which have a lot of churches on the Crimean Peninsula, what they do, they try to, there are some attempts to establish autonomous churches, because under the Russian legislation you cannot establish a new association. You have to become part of the existing association which have been in place until 2001 or 1991, because our association doesn't want to become the part of the pro-Kremlin association. We have a big problem here. Today, 17 religious communities and churches in the Crimea agreed or gave their consent to switch over to the 50th day community under the leadership of the Bishop Grabovenko, and we are involved in the negotiations now. And Grabovenko is member of the spiritual council under the President of Russian Federation Putin. He is a rather serious Ukraine-phobe, and he hates Ukraine, but there is a big problem, and they try to break us down. And our forecasts are as follows: that the real Protestant church will have to become the underground one. And but those who, if the Russians will manage to break some of them, they will become the pro-Russian churches, or maybe the believers or religious community of this type will disappear altogether. So I call upon the international community to pay serious attention to that. It's very difficult for us to act, to work in the Crimea, even to visit the Crimea. So we would like to have more people from international organizations coming to the Crimea or the international media, so that they could monitor the available situation there and establish direct contacts, because for us it's very difficult to do like something like that. Only the glassness or the information spread all over the world can somehow, let's say, contain the pro-Russian authorities who try to wage the war against the different religious communities, including the Protestant one.
So, in order to summarize all the above, I give floor Ukrainian religious scientist Oleksandr Sagan. In my report, I would like to touch several aspects of this very important problem. The first one is that the problem of religious community and organization activities, independently of Crimean situation, has no legal support, because there is nothing like a notion or definition of annexed territories or something like that in this piece of legislation. And if any religious community would like to be registered according to Russian legislation, never a church never any church accept that Crimea is a Russian territory. So, because it could be result in the changes of the statute. Again, this question could not be solved that religious way, because this is very strict position, very strict regulation in Russia that any church must be Russian only in the Russian territory. So we are speaking on the fact that the problem of existed Muslim communities in Crimea has only one political way out. Unfortunately, Ukraine as a state neglects this factor, and our speakers today already mentioned briefly that we must be very clear that Russian Federation must fulfill its obligation according to international treaties and agreements been signed by Russia. We are speaking not only about religious communities, but public organization, Crimean Tatar schools and national ethnic communities and societies, because they are surviving. Very difficult for them to stay here, because in that sense nobody will allow them to wear say national colors of Ukraine. Not only the crowd will not allow this, but as well the authorities in Crimea. Again, another problem we're facing now. The Russian party abuses the aspect of their own understanding of what should be a statute. And 1 month ago, lines of incorporation, I downloaded this document from official database. For instance, the statute of Simferopol Crimean eparchy, and in fact they changed all the basic data, and the statute says that in legal sense the demands have been fixed in this statute, so the role of Kiev is diminished there. So we're speaking about political pressure, political survivor of all the pro-Ukrainian, pro-Tatar or some other communities and churches, organizations, religious communities that did not agree to be registered with Russian organizations. And Reverend Clement traveled back from Crimea, and he gave us information on very Jesuitic types of pressure over the clergy in Crimea. This delay from 1st March to 1st January. No, this came to life not because they are very mild and kind-hearted, but because the re-registration process with the Moscow eparchy as well has been delayed, and the documents are not satisfying for local Russian authorities, and Kiev Metropolitan Office has already refused to collect proper documents. This issue is to be solved now between the eparchies themselves. So, and finally, I would like to stress out that as being public organizations, and I am, for instance, an expert in scientific and expert council on religious problems in the Ministry of Culture of Ukraine, and lately I have already touched the issue of special document we must adopt, we must sign it as an, say, request to Ukrainian authorities to immediately initiate its plea to international agencies as well as to Russian Federation authorities that the issues we are speaking of now should not be chaotic or, say, contractual, so to say, because we're speaking about case-to-case basis, but we must exercise systematic approach for us to understand that, yes, Ukraine is defending its loyal citizens, loyal organizations. Unfortunately, many of them had to be registered as Russian citizens with Russian passports. The same Reverend Cleveland writes that in Easter Day there were much more people visiting church than before. It means that people that are stayed in occupation there still tend to go to Ukrainian church. That's why we must cover them with our, expand our support for them. And in Crimea, for instance, the ATO problems are secondary. The primary problems for them are religious beliefs, and they are disappointed to a certain extent that Ukraine as a nation is not very interested in their life there in Crimea. Thank you. Thank you, Alexander. I immediately have clarification.
You said that the Ukrainian state does not do, 100% what they can do in order to protect the religious communities in the occupied Crimea. What Ukraine has to do, in addition to what you already mentioned, or like international institutions to provide help or assistance to those communities. Today, actually, we can develop or outline, and unfortunately, over the last year which elapsed, they have not been able to create a strategy in order to protect or defend the basic freedom of man. I'm talking about the freedom of conscience. And the world has already developed and provided quite a number of different mechanisms in order to protect the freedom of conscience. Because this freedom is a code sign or code symbol for the whole world, to the whole world. In any American or Englishman or citizen of Europe, they know that this is a basic freedom which has to be defended and protected anyway. Today we do not know, at least I do not know, a single specialized address or let's say which would act in advance. We have to respond to the something which happened, to the facts, and we in our ministries have to see the documents to, I would say this way, which would be supporting the religious communities in the field. In each specific case, there are different approaches because the requirements of each religious community are different, very much different. When I was talking to Ms. Clement, he named listed about 5 points or 5 items of most required, badly needed things. And they will send those messages to the Minister of Foreign Affairs and other ministers, but so far there is no feedback. I don't want to be more specific on the specific point, but there are some elementary things which would really provide support to those communities in the Crimea. Unfortunately, neither the Minister of Justice nor the MFA actually respond to this address approach. Are there any other questions to our guests? You're most welcome if you do have. Sergei Kudnikov, Man Forum Agency. I have the question to the Sheikh Said. Do you know, as a person who has a very good contact with Majlis, do you know anything about the strategy to return Crimea to Ukraine? And perhaps some assistance in this specific issue could be provided by some Muslim world, because the status of the Crimean Tatar people or nation encounters, as they say, a very big problem. Another question to Mr. Alexander. This summer, we are going to mark a millennium since the day of death of Prince Vladimir. As a member of the community of military historians of Ukraine, we discussed that topic, and perhaps you know that well, that the first millennium of baptism, which happened under the Prince was called in 1988, and There are a lot of scholarly or scientific questions regarding this specific event. Is it possible, to which extent, how much it is possible to baptize Ukraine again, like they did that in 988? This is no longer in both in theological or legal aspect. This is not in full conformity with the God. Christ has risen. The first thing which I would like to tell you that the leaders of Majlis, in general speaking, all the Muslims of Ukraine, they dream about Crimea coming back to the Ukraine, because to us this is a special place. This is the cradle of Islam in Ukraine. This is the territory from where, for many centuries, the Islam was spread all over Ukraine for many centuries. That's why it's a certain tragedy that they actually took away from us this big piece, and actually they broke our contacts and ties with the first source, or original source of Islam in Ukraine. Number two, I'm not well versed about the specific steps proposed by Majlis in order to return Crimea to Ukraine. Perhaps this is not something which is really should be voiced out loud. But I would like to say that Majlis, this is an ethnic organization. If they very much, even wish very much to return Crimea to Ukraine, they do not have any instruments or tools how to return Crimea to Ukraine. First of all, this should be resolved on the national level. I'm talking of the Ukraine as a whole. On the level of the society, Majlis can actually voice their vision and give some advice to call upon the international Ukrainian community. But Majlis doesn't have any levers to do that themselves. As for the global Muslim community, we are trying to do everything possible so the whole world knows what tragedies take place in the Crimea, what kind of tragedy is going on in Crimea. And we do not, when in the case when they not try to do it somehow kind of clandestine or something hidden, but they do it openly, obvious. And that's why we are working today in order for the whole Muslim community in Asia, Africa, and Europe, so everybody knows about Ukraine, but the problems faced by the Muslims in the Crimea, not only Muslims, different religious communities like Orthodox or Protestant, that they remain veterans of Ukraine. They never betrayed Ukraine. We are trying to do that at our level, but I'm positive that the steps to return Crimea to Ukraine, first of all, should be made by the state proper. And the question to Mr. Oleksandr, very briefly, indeed this issue pertains to Crimea directly, because the celebration of a millennium of death of Prince Vladimir in Russia, they kind of have such kind of a humble comparison. Vladimir the First, Vladimir the Second, meaning Putin, and Putin visualized himself almost the same reformer, great reformer, as the Prince Vladimir. They are going to have big festivities in Crimea. I don't know whether the Kiev Patriarchy leadership will give their consent to that, or they are going to protest. But again, this is kind of a theological event today from point of view of Russia, and they are going to enhance and to step it up. I mean, this event closer to summer, and of course we do not close our eyes on that date. Maybe Father Ievstratiy will tell more details about that. As for the steps beyond okay. If we're talking about the festivities associated with the baptism in the time of the Prince of Oskol, but we're now talking about Prince Vladimir's baptized in the Kievan Rus in 988. So there are two of those dates, and that's Prince Vladimir. So I don't think that the by major this is not a major problem. Whether what was more, let's say, important, the Askol baptizing or Vladimir baptizing Rus. Maybe the church will have their more specific point of view on this specific point. And Pichevsky wrote a lot on that issue, and many other historians. But this is issue, historical issue. If you do not turn to the political plane, this issue is open to any kind of philosophical, historical, and any other discussions.
Couple of words I may add. First of all, anybody who is interested in contemporary status of Orthodox Church, Christian Orthodox, specifically Kiev Patriarchy. Kiev Patriarchy had a Jubilee celebration of Askol baptizing as well. It was a cathedral activity in getting Askol into the among the ranks of the holy men. There are certain people that started speaking or baptizing by Andrew, the first caller, and I do not think that we need to make a contrary between the religious events, and I'm not sure that Vladimir baptizing was to transform the Kiev Rus from the slavery to the Christian state. That was a great consequences after that. Consequences in sense of religious, cultural, etc. That's why we celebrated in 2013 1025 years of baptizing, because we once again stressed out that this event, Vladimir baptizing, was a civilization choice. For Vladimir, so Kiev Rus more than 1000 years ago has decided to be with European religion rather than something else. That's why we're facing Europe now. Do not forget that we have 2 more jubilees this year, related to not less powerful names. It's 1000 years of motor death of Boris and Gleb, and second one is reburying them, 700 years of that. So if the Russian president had a name of Boris, then most probably we would have celebrated something else. And so in Russia we only can rename Moscow River into Dnipro River, then it could be okay. So they probably will erect a monument at Vorobyovy Hills, not far from Moscow University. They will not need to travel to Kiev to bow to Vladimir's monument. So they took our history, they took our monuments, and many Moscow citizens, they are convinced that they have a monument to Knight Yuri Dolgoruki, and they convinced that there is a tomb of Yuri Dolgoruki as well there. They do not know that Yuri Dolgoruki is buried in Kiev. Again, this is very tightly related to Crimean specifics, and when we're speaking about Nestor already pointed out that Vladimir was not baptized in Khersonesk, he was baptized in Kiev or Vasilkov. So he says it's not a true view, but the fact that Putin justified Crimean occupation, that Crimea is a sacred place, sacred land for Russian Federation, because Vladimir was baptized then. According to our church, it is not proper. It's not a fact. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we have to end up this briefing. You have an opportunity to have certain networking out of this panel, but once again we will touch the issue of Crimea, and we will discuss all the aspects starting from religious up to political issues. Thank you, colleagues. Our next briefing is in 5 minutes.